call this meeting to order. Today is February 10, 2023. This is the 24th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2002. Members are participating by Zoom and in person. Just a few comments before we start. Before anybody takes the floor, you have to be recognized by the chair, and I'll recognize you. Those who are participating by Zoom, there is a icon on the bottom of your screen. The globe icon. You can either listen to the original language in both English and French, or the interpretation in either English or French. And pursuant to the standing order of 1082 of Subcommittee is going to be studying the issue of the Chinese government's residential boarding schools and preschools in the Tibetan autonomous regions and all Tibetan autonomous prefectures and counties. We have 4 witnesses with us, 2 in person and 2 participating by Zoom. As individuals, Ms. Chami Lahmo, community organizer and human rights activist. Thanks for being here in person. Dr. Gail Lowe, academic researcher and educational sociologist. Thanks for being here today. From Human Rights Watch, Ms. Sophie Richardson, thanks for being here today. And Tibet Action Institute witness, Ms. Ladon Teteyong, director, who is also participating by video conference. We're going to have 5 minutes for each witness. We'll start with those in person. I'll give a hand signal at 1 minute. There's 1 minute left, 30 seconds, and then you'll just have to conclude your remarks.
Chair, if you don't mind, can I make a request for perhaps Sophie to go first, Ladin to go second, third, Dr. Jallo, and lastly me?
We can do that. Usually I recognize you. So for other interventions, let's do that. But we'll start off with, from Zoom, Sophie Richardson, please, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for having me on behalf of Human Rights Watch. We appreciate the opportunity to participate and also wanted to pass our congratulations on for the extraordinary passage of M62 last week, which was a wonderful effort to behold. Human Rights Watch began tracking language medium education issues in Tibetan areas more than a decade ago, when proposals to phase out Tibetan medium instruction in Tibetan areas of Qinghai province prompted protests that were crushed. The January 2016 arrest of Tashi Wangchuk, a language activist, suggested that Chinese authorities were taking a harder line on the issue. Nevertheless, it was extremely difficult to document policy shifts. However, in March 2020, we were able to publish research showing that, consistent with Chinese Communist Party Secretary General Xi Jinping's broad and aggressive assimilationist campaign of sinicization, Chinese authorities' claims to providing so-called bilingual education to Tibetan children was quite simply a lie. Our research showed that the policy carried out for the past decade across what Chinese authorities call the Tibet Autonomous Region and in Tibetan areas and other provinces has actually increased Chinese medium schooling at all levels except for the study of Tibetan language itself. Under the guise of improving access to education, Chinese authorities established compulsory bilingual kindergartens to immerse Tibetan children in Chinese language and state propaganda from age 3 in the name of strengthening the unity of nationalities. They also hired thousands of non-Tibetan speaking teachers from other parts of China under the Aid Tibet program and the promotion of ethnically mixed classes in which if even one Chinese speaking child was present, the entire class would be taught in Chinese rather than in Tibetan. In September 2019, parents and teachers in 6 rural townships in Nagchu municipality in the northern TAR told Human Rights Watch that as of March 2019, their local primary schools had switched to using Chinese as the language of education. These are violations of international human rights law and of the Chinese Constitution. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights stipulate respect for mother tongue education. UN committees on the rights of the child, economic, social, and cultural rights, and the elimination of racial discrimination have all expressed concern over the rights of Tibetans to education in their own language and culture across China. China's constitution guarantees minority language rights. Moreover, these policies are also in profound tension with best practices with respect to education, which strongly suggests mastery in the mother tongue prior to learning other languages. It is worth noting that many of the Tibetan parents to whom we spoke stressed that they wanted their children to learn both languages, but not at the cost of learning in just one of those. These policies are a profound threat to Tibetans' identity. The Canadian government should not only raise its concerns about these practices in bilateral meetings and international forums, but also actively support the preservation of Tibetan medium education, including teaching materials and teachers. I'm happy to provide more recommendations, but I want to make sure not to exceed my time. Thank you very much.
You still have 2 minutes. One minute, 45 seconds.
I was much too efficient. My apologies. Congress is terribly strict. Perhaps then I can fill in some of the details. The Chinese government, we think, accomplished the implementation of these policies partly through some very deliberate ambiguity about what teachers and schools were meant to do. But often when faced with access only, for example, to Chinese medium materials for teaching, schools had no choices but to use those materials since there simply weren't Tibetan medium materials available to people. Similarly, the restrictions on the languages that the teachers who were being recruited themselves were capable of teaching in tipped the balance in many different circumstances. I think the fact that we've observed the authorities persecute, I think not just prosecute, but persecute individuals who have spoken up in defense of Tibetan medium education makes very clear that what might be considered a not terribly incendiary academic matter in other contexts is part of a larger political campaign. And it's consistent with what we have documented with respect to other critical components of Tibetans' identity, not least the extraordinary encroachments on Tibetans' rights to religion and how it is practiced. We've seen similar changes in policy and management of religion by Chinese authorities that effectively encroaches on individuals' abilities to live their identities as international human rights law guarantees them the right to do.
Thank you. And we'll continue on with Ms. Ladon Tetong, sorry for the pronunciation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, for making this happen. I will read my remarks and I'm going to time myself here because it's best if I help myself keep time. So thank you. My father was born in a free and independent Tibet in 1934. My eldest brother was born in a Tibetan refugee camp in India. I was born on the land of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations in Victoria, from Vancouver Island. As a Tibetan and a Canadian, my two worlds sadly collided a couple of years ago when my organization, Tibet Action, began researching reports that Tibetan parents were being coerced to send their children, including those as young as 4 and 5 years old, away to boarding schools. In the course of our research, we found that China had been constructing a massive colonial boarding school system in Tibet, one that threatens the very survival of the Tibetan people and the nation because they so wholly and completely have targeted the future of Tibet, our children, and even the very youngest ones. This school system is the cornerstone of a broader effort to wipe out current and future resistance of our fiercely proud Tibetan people by eliminating our language, our religion, and our way of life. And the colonial boarding school system itself streamlines and fast tracks this genocidal plan. by ripping Tibetan children from their roots, stealing the language from their tongues, and attempting to turn them into something that they are not. Just some high-level findings from our report. At least 800,000 Tibetan children across all of historical Tibet, not just the Tibet Autonomous Region or what China calls Tibet, representing 78% of all Tibetan school children ages 6 to 18 are now separated from their families and living in colonial boarding schools. And this number does not include the 4 and 5-year-olds being made to live in boarding preschools in rural areas because China is actively trying to hide the existence of that system. These children are forbidden from practicing religion. They're cut off from authentic Tibetan culture, beyond, of course, what the Communist Party approves of and what you'll see in the propaganda, which is wearing Tibetan clothing and doing Tibetan dance, circle dance. These kids are taught almost entirely in Chinese, maybe with one Tibetan language class, by mostly Chinese teachers or increasingly more and more Chinese teachers, and from Chinese textbooks that reflect China's life, history, culture, and values, and completely denies Tibet's own rich and ancient history and culture, our stories. On top of this, they're subjected to intense political indoctrination. Sophie has said it in the past, even the youngest children getting intense political indoctrination like Xi Jinping thought. It says they must be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese nation first and above all else. And of course, Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children to live in these schools because the authorities have closed the local village schools, along with most privately run Tibetan schools or monastery schools, and not to mention the Tibetans having lived 70 years under Chinese occupation and facing intense violence from the state know that you can't resist these kind of central government directives at the grassroots level without facing severe consequences. Parents who resist or refuse are threatened with fines and other serious consequences. And of course, the children have no choice. One person from Tibet described the situation like this. This is a quote, "I know of children aged 4 to 5 who don't want to be separated from their mothers. They're forced to go to boarding schools, and in some cases, they cry for days, sticking to their mother's laps. Both the children and the parents are unwilling." This insidious policy to isolate children from their families so as to erase their Tibetan identity and replace it with a Chinese identity was developed at the highest levels of the Communist Party. And it is blatantly a racist policy. Just as Tibetan parents don't want to have to send their children away, Chinese people don't want to send their children away either. And actually a backlash against school consolidation policies in China led the State Council to rule in 2012 that all levels of school should be in principle non-residential, especially for the young children in grades 1 to 3. And that very same State Council decreed in 2015 that in so-called minority areas, officials must strengthen boarding school construction and achieve the goal that students of all ethnic minorities will study in a school, live in a school, and grow up in a school.
Ms. Tedong,
So
if you could just wrap up.
Since releasing this report, we've been asked many times from many people why the world doesn't know. How did we miss this? And I just want to say that the total information blackout and lockdown of Tibet has resulted in such a dearth of information from Tibet that there's no foreign media. Tibetans can't get in or out. Transnational repression, punitive measures against corporations who might quote the Dalai Lama or governments who speak out in favor of Tibet. This has resulted in this silence by design. And what's happening in Tibet is a crisis. It threatens our ancient civilization. And it is, in a way, like a genocide 2.0, because it's happening in real time right now, but with no pictures, very few, no videos, and no one really able to report what's happening from the ground, unlike any other place on Earth. And so I would ask the Canadian government, all of you, to help us expose this system because the Chinese government is trying to hide it, and to pay special extra attention to bringing Tibet up in every possible way with Beijing and continuing to push the Chinese government for the human rights and freedom of the Tibetan people, because They are working very hard to erase us, not just inside Tibet, but in the world at large.
Thank you. And we'll continue on. Thank you for that, Ms. Teton. And we'll continue on with Dr. Gale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, all of you, for allowing me to speak to you about the system of the colonial boarding school in Tibet. I'm here to share my research findings and what I have personally witnessed about the boarding preschool, as this is a completely hidden policy of the Chinese government. Based on the more than 50 boarding preschool I have seen with my own eyes, I estimate at least 100,000 Tibetan children from age 4 to 6 are now living separate from their parents, family, and community. After I received my PhD at the University of Toronto, I returned to Tibet in 2015. I then started teaching at Yunnan Normal University. The following year, my brother called me because he was concerned about his 2 granddaughters' behavior. I went home to see them. This was the first time I came in contact with a colonial boarding preschool. I picked up my 2 grandniece, one age 4, one in age 5, from their boarding preschool on Friday evening, and then carefully observed them while they were at home. Clearly, I saw they did not hug their grandparent and had almost no emotional exchange with their own family members. They sat a little further away from all of us, family members, almost like guests or strangers in their own home. They conversed with each other only in Mandarin and Chinese language. This was after just 3 months in the new boarding preschool in our local township. Prior to this, they spoke no Mandarin and were raised in an entire Tibetan-speaking environment. I realized that my family's case was not unique. The Chinese government was implementing a mandatory preschool education policy over all Tibet. For the following 3 years, during the summer vacation, I did academic field work on this topic. I visited boarding preschool across all eastern Tibet, what China now calls Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, and Sichuan. I spoke with kids, parents, teachers, and other village stakeholders, and my conclusion was the same as with my 2 grandnieces. It is very important to understand that Tibetan parents have no real choice about whether to send their children away to the boarding school, even those very young children in the rural area of Tibet, just age 4 to 6 years old, must attend a boarding preschool. Local village schools have been shut down. The Tibetan private schools have been shut down. There are really no local options and no Tibetan option left for parents who don't want to send their children away to those government boarding preschools. This is all by design. The Chinese government invests vast amounts of the resource and much careful thought into pulling the Tibetan children out from our culture and from their family by the root. They do this by teaching almost entirely in Mandarin, the Chinese language, and by making the environment, entire learning environment, into a pure Chinese environment. Even the pedagogical approach is very sophisticated. For example, students were showed Chinese cultural object and then told them to close their eyes, they imagine the object. And then they asked to draw what they imagined. So later on, they ask kids to explain what they have drawn in Chinese Mandarin. This is a very intentional method to shift children's entire psychological foundation from Tibetan to Chinese. China is weaponizing the school system, intentionally committed genocide. I am deeply concerned for the well-being of those children, their parents, and the future survival of Tibetan identity and culture. If this colonial boarding school policy continues for more than 20 years, especially the boarding preschool policy, I fear China will end our civilization and cause the irreparable harm to our people. Thanks very much. I stand here.
Thank you, Dr. Gale, for your testimony. And last, we have Lemo, please, for Ms. Lemo for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Tisile ani bonjour, hello everybody. I'm Chimi Lamo. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge and express my gratitude to the original caretakers of this land, to the elders of the past and present, and to any who should be here and may be here today physically, mentally, and spiritually. I was born stateless into a Tibetan refugee settlement camp in South India. And until I was 11 years old, I carried not a passport, but an identity certificate issued by the Indian government, which I needed to renew every single year to maintain my precarious political existence as a person with no homeland. At 11, I emigrated to Toronto, to a neighborhood called Parkdale. Parkdale has one of the largest Tibetan communities in exile outside of India and Nepal. It's one of the very few places where Tibetans have recreated both our national identity and our cultural community in a safe place that allows us to be who we are. Where we celebrate our culture, learn our language, study our scriptures, and pass our rich ancient heritage to the next generation. Every Wednesday, we gather in Little Tibet to celebrate those parts of our identity and culture that are banned and criminalized inside of Tibet. So culture is often referred to as the way of life of an entire society. It's the collective programming of the mind. For a community, that guides the collective action, thoughts, and feelings. It's what makes us unique, human. It's part of what dignifies our existence and gives meaning to our lives. However, China's colonial rule over Tibet has targeted and has continuously attacked every aspect of this culture. Language, faith, music, literature, our nomadic way of life, our ancestral branches of knowledge that have allowed us to live as compassionate stewards of one of the most fragile ecosystems in the planet. The Chinese Communist Party has basically severed our entire nation into two. Those on the outside who cannot go inside because we're denied visas, and those who are inside cannot leave because they do not have passports. That has been the fact of a Tibetan life for a long time. And now the Chinese government's assault on Tibetans has reached a breaking point. Chinese authorities are targeting the three foundational pillars of our Tibetan identity: religion, language, and our nomadic way of life, for complete elimination. This eliminationist project is being carried out in every space, in the monasteries, workplaces, primary, nursery schools, on the grasslands in towns, neighborhoods, and private homes. There is no Tibetan space that remains beyond the intrusive reach of the Chinese state today. Millions of nomads have been relocated from the grasslands into reservation-style housing projects, which basically land them in the middle of nowhere, with little to no access to jobs, so there's no future for young people to survive or even thrive. In the monasteries, monks are being Monks and nuns are being slowly strangled with rules and regulations that push them out and block new ones from joining. And for those that remain, there's no time for religious studies because they're too busy studying Xi Jinping's thought and the latest propaganda by Beijing forced upon them. For anyone who's paying attention, there's no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party is hell-bent on trying to eradicate our core identity, turning Tibetans into Chinese. That alone is the final goal of this cradle-to-grave project of forced assimilation, starting with the mandatory enrollment of 4 to 6-year-olds in preschool boarding. Not to mention nearly 1 million children are being stripped away from their parents, forced or coerced into learning, thinking, and even imagining in Chinese instead of Tibetan. So I stand here today as a Tibetan and a Canadian to ask you to please speak out for Tibet. Our silence emboldens the CCP. That's why we see them blatantly sending spy balloons around the world. That's why they're setting up police stations in our democratic nations, interfere with our elections, threaten and intimidate Canadians on Canadian soil. It is imperative that we take a stand and we act. Now, some may say that Canada has no place speaking out because of our own legacies. Yet I say this is exactly why Canada needs to speak out. This is precisely why we have even a greater duty and moral obligation to speak out. We know from our own mistakes about the intergenerational trauma and the grief caused by these type of schools, about the genocidal legacies that they leave behind for generations and generations after. We need to speak out about our experiences, what could be done differently, and make sure that it never happens again, neither here nor anywhere else. There's so much that we can do to help Tibet. 1, just issuing a statement that echoes the concerns of the 4 UN special rapporteurs and call on China to shut down these colonial boarding school systems inside of Tibet. That includes Kham and Amdo. 2, this body can definitely undertake a study to investigate the CCP's colonial preschool boarding, that there is no information, that the Chinese government is clearly hiding, doing everything they can to hide this policy because even they know that this is wrong. And we need to make sure that folks like Dr. Jallo and the experts that are risking their lives to be here in front of you today to tell you the truth about these hidden policies of the Chinese government are taken seriously. Thirdly, to impose sanctions on these Chinese officials and these architects that are overseeing these colonial boarding schools under the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. Finally, I want to thank you and each and every single person that's listening today, because together we can do this right and make sure that it doesn't happen again anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lemo. And now we'll move on to questions. Our first round will be 7 minutes. First will be Mr. Abultayev, then Mr. Vrani, and we'll continue on with the other members. Mr. Abultayev, for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the witnesses for appearing today before committee. Ms. Lamo, you've answered some of the questions that I was going to ask you by outlining the final strategy of the Chinese regime or the Chinese Communist Party over the Tibet region and the Tibet population. But the question that begs itself about those residential schools is when was this problem was known to the international community and to Canada? When was the highlight on this took place? You're talking about 20 years from now, there will be probably complete a change of the culture, the education system, the way these generations are going to grow to the future. So I think would be important to understand when was this issue become known to the international community and to Canada, and what have you been hearing from the international community on this issue? So the question to Ms. Lamo, and I believe to the Tibet Action Institute, Ms. Titon. Thank you.
I believe Ladin Law would be a great speaker to respond to your question because they actually put out the report in 2020, and the international community has definitely responded. We see UK has spoken out. We have also attached in the briefing document the letter by Congressional Congressman Jim McGovern from the CECC that have called out China to basically shut down the colonial boarding schools. We need Canada to step up. UK has risen, US has risen, UN has also done their own research to tell us that 1 million children are basically being ripped away from their parents. So it's time for Canada to join on that. Ladinla.
Yeah, thank you. It really has just been this last year. We put the report out and we're briefing some governments behind the scenes just before last December, so a year ago December, and then yeah, there has been some forward movement now. I think with the UN Special Rapporteur speaking out recently, they just put out a press release on Monday about their communication to the Chinese government, calling for more information on the school system and saying that it appears to be in violation of basically every agreement the Chinese government has made on any rights that Tibetans might have. But they are, this is in a way. So I think Dr. Gello always says it best. I mean, there have always been colonial boarding schools in Tibet. The entire time the Chinese government has been there. He was part of a wave of academics and scholars and Tibetans trying to hold a line and push for Tibetan content and curriculum in those schools for years. That space has steadily been shrinking. And to the point now under Xi Jinping and these second generation ethnic policies that the last number of years, they've really taken it to the next level in terms of, primary school education no longer being taught in Tibetan and now preschool. And it didn't used to be Tibetans had to attend preschool, though it would be great if they were attending Tibetan language-based, mother tongue-based preschool. Tibetans would have no problem with that and not having to do that in a boarding school, but locally. So this is all new under Xi Jinping, and it's like we see in general.
Dr. Gello toured Eastern Tibet as per your testimony. What I would be curious to know, have you had a chance to look at the curriculum, the academic curriculum that is taught to these, or these, let's say it's imposed on these students?
Yeah, let me address the two parts. The colonial boarding school started in 1979. Until now, they're running, but situation getting worse and worse. On top of that, under the Xi Jinping's regime, they newly produced a new policy for the having the boarding preschool education system. And I deeply engaged with the curriculum issue and the contents of the textbook over the 10 years when I was in teaching in my former university. For example, I produced the 2 Tibetan knowledge-based textbook, and I did also did some of the training conference. Then 1 year after, China stopped that.
Would you be able to give us some examples from these textbooks that raise a flag over what they're trying to do, what the Chinese government is trying to do, and how that is going to really affect the future of these young generations?
Okay. Yeah, it's they're making the pure Chinese atmosphere cultural environment for the kids in the school. For example, they shut down the Tibetan object or Tibetan historical figures, the Tibetan cultural environment in the classroom in 2018. And also, they're asking kids to wearing the Chinese soldier dress as a uniform. And also, every day required to sing the Chinese national song when they enter the school.
I have a question here too, because we've got about 30, 40 seconds. do parents or is parents able to visit their kids in those schools?
There are two types. The boarding preschool, the parents only allowed to pick up them on the Friday evening and drop them the Sunday evening. Those are kids age 4 to 6. Other boarding school area, they almost every 3 months they can see their parents.
Thank you, Mr. Now for 7 minutes, Mr. Vrani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to start by saying Tujiche Ntashidle. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Ms. Richardson, for your contributions as well. And thank you to the members of this committee and to the chair for facilitating this important meeting and this important study. In my 7 years representing the community of Parkdale that Ms. Lama was mentioning, I've certainly learned a great deal about Tibet and the Tibetan struggle. And in my role of chair of Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, I've taken some encouragement at certain times in terms of the way things were heading in terms of government policy and sort of international reaction. This testimony today, however, is quite shocking. So the encouraging parts are things such as, launching an Indo-Pacific strategy that specifically mentions Tibetan human rights violations. It's things like the vote that happened in December on relaunching a Sino-Tibetan dialogue that has been stalled since His Holiness gave up political power to the Sikyong. And really, that dialogue process has been moribund for about the last 10 years. I think having this study is really, really critical, and I'm glad we're having it. But what I want to know, I guess, first of all, is in terms of sort of the impact on the children and also the impact on the parents. So perhaps, Dr. Gyalo, can you tell us very specifically what would happen in the TAR or in any Tibetan majority region if a parent outright tried to refuse sending their kids to either the preschool or to the boarding schools ages 6 to 18? What are the consequences?
Okay, yeah. The parents seems like they almost have any possible way to oppose the policy to send their kids to school, because they warn them first, if you don't send your kids to pre-boarding school, then later on you cannot get enrolled grade 1, which is you won't get the education. Second is simply block your name from the government system when you get benefit or any welfare from governments. And then still you don't send it, and then they send the police to put you in jail.
In that context, the children would be removed by force. Is that fair?
Of course, they're going to keep maintaining the school.
Okay, and I want to turn to Ms. Lamo because you referenced sort of the legacy of Canada with respect to residential schools, and we're all thinking about the Indigenous plight for 150 years in this country, and it's a horrific legacy. A lot of that legacy is also about children trying to escape, flee, run, trying to resist. Is there evidence, and perhaps Dr. Gyalo, Ladan Tetang, or Sophie Richardson, is there evidence of children trying to get out of the system, and what happens to them if they do try to resist in the schools?
There's the two options, very clear. One option is they're going to grab you to drop back you to school. Other ways, they put you in another far distance of school. You never be able to run away.
Move you even further. And tell me, how has this been exacerbated by, and if Ms. Richardson or Ms. Tetong want to join in this response, but how has this been exacerbated by the rise of sort of the surveillance state under Xi Jinping? I understand that there are 2 cameras for every human being in the PRC, for example. That is quite overwhelming. But how does that impede upon one's ability to resist or flee in this context? So perhaps Ms. Richardson or Ms. Tetong?
Thank you. Just briefly, Human Rights Watch has done quite a bit of research about the surveillance state across China, and the ability of authorities to monitor virtually all any sort of any and all electronic communications, but also indeed to use tools to track people's movement. And I think it's fair to say that the Tibetan Plateau is awash with this kind of technology, and it's deployed in ways that prevent people from being able to communicate or organize. If I can just add briefly about the impacts on children and family members, we had people talk to us about the inability of children to communicate with family members once they had really been forced to study entirely in Chinese. That children obviously were not able to read traditional texts, and that they were not able to participate in religious rites because they simply didn't have the language comprehension to do so. And I think that those are some of the ways in which you can so clearly see the destruction to families and to the transmission of knowledge simply by switching out the medium of education. But Ladin will certainly have more to add to that.
Yeah, we've actually had reports from Tibet, very limited, but we have had reports just of even Tibetan students in these schools protesting the crackdown on language, the removal of Tibetan from, because this has sort of intensified over the last number of years. And, we try to look into these things, and it's virtually impossible because the information blackout is so complete. So that's, we also, one thing I would just say about the impact on children and families, we've actually heard from a number of Tibetans who felt like they had no other choice to send their kids, also felt like, well, at least if my child learns Chinese like I didn't, then they will have a better chance because the world all around them is changing so quickly. And actually then they expressed regret later that the kids that came home to them were just in so many ways different, and they had grown so apart, and it just broke them. It made them feel they had made the wrong decision.
Ms. Titong, if I could just go further with you on one issue. You mentioned sort of the discriminatory application of these policies, and I recall reading from that UN longer document that while these schools exist, they're applied to something like 22% of minority children, but to 78% of Tibetan minority children. So can you comment upon that, upon the direct application over application towards Tibetans, and what you read in that vis-a-vis the Chinese government's policies?
Yeah, so in the most rural areas of China, where you would think that, if this is really about what the Chinese will say, the challenges of the sparsely populated Tibetan plateau and the topography and just how difficult it is to get to school, in the most rural areas of China, the rate of boarding is like 20-ish%, 20 something, average across. And so it really isn't, there's no comparison. This is targeting not just Tibetan children, Uyghur and Southern Mongolian children as well. But of course, in East Turkestan or Xinjiang, what China calls the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, there are different circumstances because many of those kids' parents are in camps or in detention. And for the Southern Mongolians, they've really fought back against language policies in a way that has helped on some level to sort of delay a bit more. But we don't know all of the details because it's so difficult to get information, but we know that they are also boarding at a very high rate. I think Tibet is always kind of next level. It's always, sadly, a little ahead of everyone else because of Tibet's political claims to independence and history. The Chinese government treats it and the global support that Tibet has enjoyed, the Chinese government treats Tibet very, very, very differently in many ways earlier than, say, the other places.
Thank you, Ms. Tedon. And we're going to continue avec that.
We will continue to hear from our next member. Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have 7 minutes, sir. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here for this highly important study carried out by our committee. I am one of your allies. I have spent time in China, but don't worry about that. Ms. Titong, I was hearing you say, you've told us that some families regretted their choices, given that the effect was pernicious on the children, was negative. So tell me, should a family refuse to send their child to a residential school? Is it possible, by the way, for them to send the child? And if they don't, what are the sanctions? What are the reprisals carried out by the government on the family?
So there used to be, thank you for that question. There used to be more options, and they've been shrinking steadily every year. So Tibetans could send kids to some Tibetan private schools, or the monasteries were running schools for secular education, these kind of things. And the Chinese government has cracked down on all of it. So when I say that choice to send them, some parents would have some years ago had a somewhat of a choice between a Tibetan-run school or this school where they're really going to get a strong Chinese language education. And in the case where they made that decision for whatever reason, that's what I was talking about, that kind of regret. And then the consequences really, so one thing that is very clear to us in our research is that for many of the Tibetans who want to resist or who try to resist, they've just gotten much better at pressuring people before they even consider getting to the point of not sending. What parents do, which really reminds me of the stories of the residential schools in Canada that I have heard, parents now are moving to urban areas because there are day schools there. So they'll move the whole family, or not the whole family, they'll separate the family, move with a child or children to the urban area so that the kids can go to a day school. Or they will live in there, like with the 4 and 5-year-olds. We've heard of nomadic communities taking turns, family by family, going and living near the school, though they can't even see the kids, but just so someone from that community is near those kids and living in their car all week long. And yeah, those are the kind of stories we're hearing now.
Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have heard of the pretty much ban to speak Tibetan for these children. These children have to give up their culture and their religious practices. And of course, the Chinese school is based entirely on China thought, socialist thought, and so on, communist thought. When a child exposed to this sort of training imposed by the Chinese government, what are the effects on the child? What's the results, all said and done, on a young Tibetan who has been forced to attend such a residential boarding school? When they come out of it, is it the same person, or have they really been changed?
Thank you for your question. This is a key question, I think. When they came, as I mentioned in my statement, right after 3 months, they feel like become a guest and a stranger at home. This is how they pulling our kids from their roots, started by from home.
Oui, et ça.
Yes, and this reminds me, well, of course, one must be careful when we compare situations, but there were residential boarding schools here for Indigenous peoples who were forcefully assimilated. And in Canada, the reconciliation underway, has led to that being called by some a cultural genocide. And what's going on in Tibet is a cultural genocide. Would you be ready to put it that way?
Yes, definitely. This is a clear symbol of the cultural genocide, I think.
Under the Genocide Convention, separating children from their parents is stated as a genocide. And even at the risk of it being a genocide, we, as part of the international community, have an obligation to ensure that we intervene and, if need be, punish the perpetrators.
Vous arrivez, et c'est exactement.
Yes, you've reached pretty much my conclusion, and that's what I was about to say. Canada has signed the Pact on Genocide involving the ban on genocide, and once you sign such an international agreement, we have obligations, and Canada has obligations. Do you think that Canada is doing enough as a signatory of the 1958 Geneva document? Do you think we're doing enough? Because, that pact is clear, that convention is clear, rather. When there's a mere risk of genocide, we are held to take action. And if we're not doing enough, what should we do?
We've provided the recommendations, but I'm happy to repeat them. In response to your question, or do you think Canada is doing enough? This is the opportunity to do something. It's been about a year and a half where experts, Dr. Jallo, Ladunla, have been going around the world tirelessly. I know Ladunla has to spend time away from her own little ones, running back and forth. She was just in Ottawa, had to go in flight as they were canceled, and being separated for this very reason. The sacrifices being made is for Canada to be stepping up and make the actions to be able to make sure that children are no longer being separated from their families, so that we can act on our obligation to intervene.
Il reste 20 secondes.
Et on intervient de quelle façon? C'est ça.
And in what way should we take action to live up to our obligations under the covenants? What should we do? How should we take action? It's nice to say we should take action, but how? Ms. Tétung, I think you wish to answer.
Yeah, I think so. Leadership, I think, would be very helpful. So amongst like-minded nations at the UN to raise this issue. First and foremost, it sounds very basic, but the Chinese government is hiding this policy for a reason and is cutting the flow of information for a reason. And so that's because if no one knows it's happening, then there's no problem, and no problem needs no solution. So first and foremost, we need to directly condemn this policy, to bring it out and to put Beijing on notice that the world knows. And that's just like basic. Also, I think you will all appreciate the idea that Tibet is often mentioned as just Tibet added on to long statements about other things. So, and Tibet, and we are concerned about Tibet. We appreciate the continued concern for Tibet, but to really name specifically the policies, to talk and look into the question of genocide, I think it will become quite clear what is happening is far beyond just a human rights violation, and that's something that happens also to us as we sort of get put in a category as if there's just these individual violations. But what China's Xi Jinping's approach is, especially now, is so apparent. It's a total approach that is designed to eliminate Tibetans in a way that's clearly genocide, and it needs to be addressed in that way. And I think Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, our issues need to be looked at together. I think Beijing would love nothing more for us to keep all of this in silos and say this is a anti-terrorism issue, this is a separatism, this is a, and it's just too easy to, in a way, let them off the hook for the genocidal policies that they have towards everyone who is, especially Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Southern Mongolians who are not Han.
Thank you, Ms. Tétung. Merci pour ça aussi, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Brunel-Lecep. Thank you for your answers.
On with Ms. McPherson for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. This has been very helpful for us. I know. I'm a mother, and I can't even imagine the stories that you've been sharing with us this week. When I heard your testimony earlier in the week, it's all I can do, to not rush home and hug my children just a little bit closer. So certainly, I want to express my sympathies and that this is happening. I'm slightly overwhelmed by the testimony, to be perfectly honest. I like many of the other members of this committee, am banned from China because we have spoken out against the genocide happening against the Uyghur people. And I guess why I feel a little overwhelmed is that you raise the issue of making statements, using the Magnitsky-style sanctions, things that Canada can do, and it feels so fully insufficient for what needs to be done. I'd like to know, though, what has China's response been? So the report has come out. You are speaking internationally. We've had the UK, we've had the US, we've had other countries raise this and talk about this. What has China just fully denied? What has China's response been to this? Ms. Tétung, either of you?
So just quickly, and maybe Sophie could follow up with how China responds to this. Our specific charges about the residential boarding school system, they haven't said that much, although they have had some direct responses. They haven't responded to the UN, but they did put something out some time ago, I think through the Canadian Chinese embassy, if I'm remembering correctly. And they just completely denied it, and they point to their propaganda online that shows, say, Tibetan children learning Tibetan, or they have these slick videos that shows Tibetans learning Tibetan. And quickly people will say, well, how you say they're not learning Tibetan, but here they are learning Tibetan. And I just wanted to point out that and I think all Canadians can understand this, that one Tibetan language class being taught in Tibet to Tibetan children, where they are studying 9-10 hours a day in Chinese, is not enough and will not result in these young people, especially separated from their families and communities, speaking Tibetan or being Tibetan in that way. So that's one thing the Chinese government will just point to their, and they have pointed to their very carefully constructed propaganda and whatever to show that, and Tibetans dancing and singing, and they have some stuff online that I think is really telling propaganda, where the questions that these interviewers will ask the young Tibetans, either print or video, the answers of the young people are actually quite telling of how they miss their family and how they weren't happy really for a long time, homesick. I mean, it's all there, but everybody knows to be very careful in Tibet and how you express yourself. Chinese state media.
Ms. Richardson, anything you'd like to add to that?
Thank you. If I could just add quickly, the Chinese government now reflexively rejects anything that we publish as hopelessly biased and fictional. We as an organization have been sanctioned, which is not really relevant except to show that there's never a substantive conversation about the facts. And the Chinese government generally continues to insist that it is merely making education maximally available to the largest number of children, and that this is all to the public good. I think it's worth pointing out that in the 2010 decision to make to expand access to preschool education across all Tibetan areas, and particularly in the TAR, this made preschool education effectively compulsory. And so when we're thinking about what the knock-on effects of that are, one of them is that it is now effectively impossible to enroll your child in a school at subsequent levels if they have not been to one of the state-run preschools, whether it's a boarding school, whether it is not a boarding school. But it's effectively, there's no option anymore. There's no meaningful option to step away from the state-run system, because it would mean effectively taking your child out of all education at all levels. But the Chinese government has been particularly disingenuous in its responses to the concerns also raised by the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, both of which have repeatedly flagged this problem since the 90s with Chinese authorities. And typically the state's response is to just respond with the number of children in the aggregate who are being educated without answering the question about access to mother tongue education or the denial of that right.
Well, and certainly, I mean, you talk about the multilateral institutions that have looked at this, the multilateral fora, and obviously we saw with the Uyghurs that the UN, the HRC was not able to get that study, that they were not able to get the votes to make that study go forward. Is that a role Canada should play? Should we be trying to work with allied countries to inoculate against Chinese influence of other countries? Is that a role that we can play?
I cannot urge you strongly enough to do that. Canada was very supportive of the October vote, and I really hope that governments will think about that episode not as a failure, but as being 18 votes closer to yes. You are 18 votes closer to yes. These things are almost never adopted on the first go. I hope everyone is suiting up, not necessarily for the March session, but for June, to go right back into the council and try to run the same decision memo.
And I guess just
as you people voted last week, beautifully, movingly, thank you. You voted for them. Those people deserve their rights. There should be a debate in the Human Rights Council about what's happening to Uyghurs, about what's happening to Tibetan children. And I think leadership from the Canadian government in this regard is incredibly important.
Well, I have some I'll just prep it for my next round, I guess. But Mrs. Tetong, you talked a little bit about the Tibetans being, their issues being separate from Uyghurs, separate from Mongolians, separate from Hong Kongers, perhaps separate from Taiwan, whatever those issues are that we're dealing with regards to Chinese aggression. The next round, because I know I'm out of time, but the next round, I think maybe if you could articulate a little bit about how we treat Tibet as separate, but also treat it as part of this bigger issue. And so I know I can't get you to answer that right now, but it'll circle around. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, Ms. McPherson, for that. We'll continue now for 5 minutes with Ms. Vanderbilt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for this vital testimony. I do take note that it was said that China is going to great lengths to try to have an information blackout and not let it be known what is happening to Tibetan children. And the fact that, I just want to particularly thank you, Dr. Loh, as a teacher and your deep caring of children, but the fact that you were able to bring us direct, recent testimony that you saw yourself, I think is vital for this committee to be able to hear, but also to be able to amplify. And I actually thank all the members of the committee from all parties that we were able to get your testimony sort of squeezed into our calendar to make sure we had an exceptional meeting today, so that we could have this on the record, which I hope will go some way in making sure that this is known in the world. My question, and I take note that Ms. Richardson, you mentioned an attempt at sinicization. There's, I know that Ms. Tetong, you said something about looking at all of these issues together, and you know that this committee was the committee that I think was almost first in the world of any parliament to study the Uyghurs back in 2018, what was happening there at a time when China was trying very hard not to have information public on this. And I noted that there are some eerie similarities in the surveillance, in the attempt to completely eradicate a language and culture and people by taking their children. I wonder to what extent this is something that we know that Tibet, I think it was Ms. Tetong who said it's the canary in the coal mine. Tibet is sort of ahead. But at the same time, I imagine that these techniques, the technologies, this is being shared and learned from. We noted with the Uyghurs that it was the same governor that had been in Tibet who then went to Xinjiang. And I wonder to what extent China is using this against all of its minorities in a much grander sort of attempt to eradicate different peoples. If you could, I'd like to start with Dr. Loh, and then if each of you could answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And of course, over the years, when I was teaching in my former university, I had a number of the Mongolian and Uyghur colleagues. We often share the experience, exchange the ideas. In the university, during the official meeting, we pretend we don't know each other. But in the evening, we invite each other for a certain place to get dinner together. So we had that kind of experience. That experience is not simply to respond to the government's pressure on us as intellectual people. So throughout those experiences, it is clearly I can see there are similarities between boarding preschool in Uyghurs, in Xinjiang, and in Tibet. It's exactly the same. There's no differences. But on the other hand, there are some of the strategic difference between the China treating Tibetan and Uyghurs. For example, I can share with you a concrete example. In 2017, Shanghai social science academic did a social survey on that. What's the difference between from Tibetan and Uyghur from their perspective? They think wipe out Tibetan from urban city, let them back to their rural area, and then kill out the Uyghur from every city in China. That's kind of a different attitude they have from Chinese people's side.
Your own family members, the children acting like strangers in their home. I think every single parent and grandparent and aunt and uncle are can relate and are mortified at that very thought. So thank you for that testimony. Ms. Lamo, would you like to talk a little bit about the way in which this is between different cultures and different races as well?
In very brief comments, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
For sure. I want to start off by saying that there's cross-movement solidarity, and you've seen that with the Beijing Olympics. I was actually in Greece with my Uyghur and Hong Konger friends, some of us detained and arrested in different jails, but we were together. And the Chinese government's tactics, it's so clear that they're constantly duplicating the tactics used by other authoritarian regimes, whether it is surveillance, whether it's ripping children away from their families. I just want to emphasize this point. Tibet has been on lockdown by design since 2008. Prior to 2008, thousands of people were able to escape. We used to get information from experts like Dr. Jallo oftentimes. After 2008, only a trickle are able to make it through. In the past years, maybe 5 or handful have been able to get out. And so I would like to encourage people to think about what type of information have we heard from inside of Tibet? The access that we have. We were able to see the concentration camps in East Turkestan. We have not yet been able to see the boarding preschools that even the UN has not reported in their communication so far. The boarding preschools, we still do not know. So access.
Thank you. And now we'll continue on to Mr. Janis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. This is obviously very moving and tragic testimony. I want to start by asking if you know of instances or mechanisms of complicity by Western corporations or consulting firms that might be involved in investing in or supplying equipment, technology for these boarding schools, who we should be putting pressure on to end that complicity. Anybody can answer, right?
Yeah, feel free, anybody. And in general, if a witness has some commentary to give, even if the question's not been directed towards you, you can still contribute. So anybody, please.
Sophie, did you want to do the DNA, just the quick DNA link and thermals?
Sure. This is not specific to boarding schools, but several years ago, when we were writing about the forced collection of biodata of Uyghurs, we came across procurement documents suggesting that a Massachusetts-based company, Thermo Fisher, had sold DNA sequencers to the Xinjiang authorities. It was not then, and it is not now, illegal to sell those sequencers. That doesn't mean it's a great idea. Or consistent with ethics or basic human decency, and no amount of publicly beating up this company really seems to have made them change their behavior. They said they would stop selling that technology in that region. We and others found their technology on-sold into the region. They said it wasn't their fault. We can go into details if you want. But recently, we and others have found the same company selling the same equipment to authorities in the TAR. And published in September, showing that authorities are collecting.
Sorry, just because of the tight time, are there other? Could you give us the name of the company quickly? And are there other instances of other companies or consulting? And if people don't have that information at their fingertips, I think the committee would love to receive a written follow-up submission. I know it may seem a little bit obscure, but I think one key way that we try to combat these human rights abuses are to hold accountable those we have the capacity to hold accountable to a greater extent because they're based in our societies.
I'll send the links to the relevant documents we've published.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to add to this quickly? And then I'll go to another topic.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we are looking into, who there is that we could hold accountable entities or whatnot. One thing that's a kind of an interesting new area, but it's really clear for us, especially because Dr. Gallo has knowledge of all these people and characters, is the intellectual architects of these second generation ethnic policies that Xi Jinping has adopted. And the people overseeing the implementation, not just in Tibet, but also in East Turkestan or the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that those people are actually some sanction from the highest level of the state government, the central government, to go into Tibet and East Turkestan and find the fastest ways to implement across the board Tibetan Uyghur children speaking Mandarin, and what are the best methods, psychological and otherwise, to get them to learn faster. And if you can imagine, what these people to us are not academics, they're not researchers. It's next level and it's genocidal, and they should be held accountable, the individuals involved, especially if they are deputized.
Yeah, that sort of anticipated my next question, which was, I think we'd be interested in getting suggestions of corporations that might be involved in being complicit in this that should be highlighted, sanctioned, and we can also put pressure on we are putting pressure on our pension fund to not invest in areas that are going to be complicit. So is that whole? But then there's also individual accountability via Magnitsky sanctions, and there have been, to my knowledge, no application of Magnitsky sanctions to individuals involved in repression in Tibet. Or in Hong Kong. There's been some very limited use in the context of East Turkestan. Do you have names of individuals that you could forward to the committee and say, these are people we know are playing a role specifically around these boarding schools, and that they should be held accountable via Magnitsky sanctions? Personally, I think that can be a very powerful tool for deterring this kind of involvement. Is to have a clearly named names around accountability.
Just a quick answer in 30 seconds, please.
Absolutely. We couldn't agree more. And actually, the State Department did in December sanction 2 officials in Tibet, and I can send you the info. And that was hugely, hugely momentous for Tibetans. And it's new, and a lot has been going on in the world, so I don't think many people actually know about it. The other thing is we can absolutely send you some information about individuals involved.
The committee would appreciate those names, I assume, to include potentially to include in a report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Janis. And we'll continue now for 5 minutes to Mr. Brunel Doucet.
Thank you, Chair. I'll pick up on what my colleague, Member Garnett, has just been saying. We are here in this committee to draw up a report with as much evidence as possible to allow us as parliamentarians to take action, at least to require certain things, ask certain things of the current government of Canada and the Parliament. Could you say more then about very specific situations at these residential boarding schools? Could you give us more details, if possible, so that we could put it into the report? And this is for any one of you. Ms. Richardson, I see you nodding.
Share the details of all of the reporting that we've done on education policy and abuses related to it, and about cynicization more broadly across the region, if that's helpful. Many of those documents also include, as Mr. Janis was asking, the names of the relevant officials. But Ludden and others may wish to elaborate on that with respect specifically to the boarding schools.
Thank you for that question. Of course, we have who is architecting that program. The certain name I know personally for many years. I can provide his name. And also there are institutions settled by Central China, government of China in Lanzhou. They are responsible doing the research on the entire Western minority area, which is largely covers Xinjiang and Tibet.
Thank you. We'll be happy to take anything you send us. We're very lucky to have extremely efficient analysts who will help us draw up something based on what you share with us here for the committee. What we see, as most of my colleagues here present, most parliamentarians here, in the Uyghur file. For the Tibetans, though, yes, there are many similarities in the way the Chinese government, party state, is proceeding. We see a worse treatment of human rights since Xi Jinping has been in power. And I would like you to tell us more about that. If we can obtain more evidence to the effect that Xi Jinping, since he has been leading the government, things are going worse for human rights, that could help us. But is this true? Would you say that that's correct? And do you have any examples that we could use more specifically? Ms. Ladong, I saw you wish to speak.
Absolutely. We have seen under Xi Jinping just a crackdown, like people liken it to the Cultural Revolution, just really some Tibetan cultural practices and things that used to be tolerated are seemingly harmless, hanging prayer flags, building Tibetan Buddhist statues, these things being destroyed, people being forbidden from engaging in really simple Buddhist practice with seemingly no political, implications at all. Also, just restrictions on the monasteries and on the process of recognizing reincarnated lamas and these lineages that go back generations. They're just being cut, broken, and blocking. So it's sort of every angle. It's also just even blocking and banning people through, and also using surveillance to stop people from going into the monastery or observing really important Tibetan Buddhist traditions or holidays or, occasions in a way that, like, even I can't imagine out here not being able to go and do, the circumambulation of a temple to show to build merit for, it's just the very simple things, total crackdown under him.
Okay, can I add something?
Vous avez 30 secondes.
You have 30 seconds.
Wait, please, Dr. Gail Lau, please.
Xi Jinping's first term, he did not do that much. But since he stabilized his second term, he dramatically increased those high nationalism and the mission of the Communist Party combined together and then put into the curriculum increasingly. That's the one. The other example, concrete example I can give you is in 2015, when I'm sitting with those Chinese scholars, the Chinese scholars those can say, oh, we can give them a generous autonomy for the TAR, but the entire Tibetan regions are too big, right? At that time, we can talk about this. But right after 2018, those long-time friendship, the Chinese scholars start detaching with Tibetan scholar and other minority scholars. That's the entire social intimasphere that's turned into the Han nationalist idea in the society. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Monsieur Possa. Donc, on va
Thank you. We'll continue with Ms. McPherson.
thank you. Thank you very much for all of this. It's giving me certainly an awful lot to think about. I would go back, though, if I could, to Mr. Long, just to see if there was a response to that question. I know there was some, we did talk about it a little bit about how we work, how we support Tibet also within the context, but if you could go ahead with that.
Sure. Yeah, I think I was saying that the Chinese government would love nothing more for all of these issues to be addressed separately and in silos. And there are so many linkages, and there is a way that I think we need to, Tibetans and Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, we're all working together within our limited capacities. And I think it would be great if we had more government and advocacy and support for us just looking at our fights together and how they relate and how Beijing could be addressed or forced to answer for, in a way, made to answer for the way they're treating all of us, because then I think it's more powerful also. But I would say that it is really important at the same time to, what I was saying, Tibet gets a mention these days, or, and I understand it's because of the lack of information, but I also feel like there's an added responsibility because, if you look at the Uyghurs and you look at the Tibetans, in a way, what they're doing to the Uyghurs is because they didn't have attention or support, and because of the war on terror and all the reasons we know. And Tibet had that, and China intentionally set a plan to end that global support and that spotlight, to turn it off. And so I feel like we have an added responsibility now to work harder to see the whole picture. And that's, I guess, what I would say is, despite information blackout and lockdown, Tibetans have been risking their lives to get information out. There is quite a bit. It just is, it's harder to see as clearly, but I feel like we need to work harder to meet what, China, the level to which China has tried to obscure the picture, because they're doing it precisely because not things are getting better, but they're getting worse. And I think that's what's next for the other places. I hate to say it, but how long before it's silence coming from East Turkestan? How long before it's silence coming from Hong Kong? How long, it just feels what's happened to Chinese rights defenders and faith communities in China. This is not just all about all of us and our faiths being interlinked. It's about the international community too. I think we know that.
Absolutely terrifying. And it brings up to mind for me, I mean, we did see all the trouble that the United Nations had in getting information about what was happening with the Uyghurs. So, do you even have faith, do any of you even have faith that the international community can get information, even if we did get that United Nations examination, would they even have that access? Would we be able to get the information that we would require? I see you nodding, Ms. Richardson. Perhaps you'd like to start.
Sure. Look, I think the key is for other governments, and particularly democracies, to match the ambition and the discipline and the resources, to match and exceed the ambition, the discipline, and the resources that Xi Jinping is devoting to destroying human rights inside and outside the country. The UN efforts matter partly because they are about holding the Chinese government to the same standards that you presumably would want the Canadian government to be held to, and that governments have freely agreed. Nobody made the Chinese government sign human rights treaties, that signed them itself. And that's an agreement to play by the same rules and to endure the same degree of scrutiny. And if you can't have a conversation at the Human Rights Council about atrocity crimes being committed against Uyghurs, I'm not quite sure what the point of the institution is. Do we want to give up on the institution? No, we want to make it function. But there's also the reality that, in the here and now, there are communities that need relief. And that's where I think some of the kinds of domestic measures that the Canadian government could lead on, as Professor Diallo and Jimmy and Laden have mentioned, I think there's a lot of room to do everything from language and cultural preservation, supporting the kinds of efforts that are community driven, making sure that, Canadian civil servants who work on issues across China aren't only offered the opportunity to learn Chinese, but are offered the opportunity to learn Tibetan or Uyghur or Mongolian or Cantonese. I think these all matter. But I think if democracies don't come together soon to push back against a very concerted, clear plan of Xi's. The window, I think, is closing somewhat to do that. I find it, I'm on sabbatical, so I'm sort of not supposed to say these things out loud right now, but I find it highly disconcerting to see that, for example, an official from the Uyghur region is being received in the UK and Brussels. And I find it very disturbing that the EU is going ahead with another round of a bilateral human rights dialogue with the Chinese government. This is a government that should be investigated and prosecuted. Is there evidence out there to be had, and can it be gathered in service of, for example, the OHCHR report about the Uyghur region? Absolutely. Support that. Give it the political support, give it the financial support, give it the human resources that it needs. There's a lot of information out there to be assembled with a view not just towards documentation, but towards accountability. Well, people should be held accountable for these crimes.
Absolutely. And I do feel like one of the issues we have is that other countries, this is a multipolar world, other countries are looking at the way that China is silencing their own population, and that is a big risk.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We're going to have two shorter rounds now for 3.5 minutes. We're going to start with Mr. Vrani and then move to Mr. Jenis and continue. Mr. Vrani, 3.5 minutes.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure that I heard a couple of things clearly, and but I want to start with just reading something and ask Dr. Gallo if it sounds consistent. This is a document that's from the UN report of the Special Rapporteurs, 11th November 2022, and it describes students are restricted in following traditional Tibetan religious practices, connecting them back to their families and communities. There are very few Tibetan teachers in such schools, and the majority of the teachers are Han. Teachers only speak in Mandarin Chinese and conduct all of the educational activities in Mandarin. And then it continues, and it says, residential schooling of Tibetan children also produces deep and serious negative psychological and social impacts on such children, including the loss of family connections, apathy, anxiety, interaction disorders, feelings of loneliness, isolation, alienation, homesickness, and other forms of physical and emotional distress. Based on your on-the-ground experience and understanding, having visited those 50 schools, would you say that's an accurate characterization of what you've seen?
This is accurate.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yallo. Sophie Richardson, you said, I just want to make sure I was crystal clear on this, you said in your opening statement compulsory kindergarten can start as early as 3. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I'm quite taken by this aspect about the sort of the sanctions movement, because, as was rightly pointed out, we have issued some sanctions vis-a-vis Chinese leaders who are responsible for discrimination in Xinjiang. And I'd echo some of the concerns you've heard from others about wanting the list of specific names. I think that's really, really critical. Could I ask Laden and Ms. Richardson, if you could help me a little bit? I'm wearing my lawyer's hat now, but I want to understand a bit more about the discriminatory impact. So you'd mentioned a 2010 decision, Ms. Taetong. You mentioned in 2010 there's a ruling that schooling needs to be basically as local as possible, but in 2015 there's a carve-out. If you're a minority, it can be as far away as possible. That's okay. And Ms. Richardson, if you could answer this point about where the Chinese are not only violating international covenants, but their own domestic laws. And if you could identify which domestic laws are in violation, I think that would be helpful for this committee. So over to you, the two of you. So Laden and then Ms. Richardson.
Yeah, the 2012, I believe it was, State Council decree about education in principle should be local, especially at the youngest stages. That was 2012, and this very same State Council, now note the timeline, 2015, as Xi Jinping and this whole second generation ethnic policy stuff is taking off, or his buy-in to that idea. 2015 is the State Council decision on ethnic education. I'm getting the name wrong, but same State Council said in that children of ethnic minorities should that we should increase boarding school construction, and children of ethnic minorities should live in a school, grow up in a school. So that's the difference here, is that this is not about education and the ideals of education and universal pre-K and whatever. This is specifically targeted policies for Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, and the idea that bilingual education is one of your mother tongue language classes in a day is laughable.
Thank you, Ms. Tatang, and we'll continue with our next round. Mr. Janis for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So a few times it's been sort of referenced that I think one way that Canadians will kind of process this information is through comparisons to the horrors of residential schools here in Canada. I wonder if anybody wants to reflect a little bit more specifically on, for those that are making that comparison, would you identify as the similarities and the differences, and also how does that shape Canada's positioning in terms of being able to speak specifically into these issues from our own experience as a nation? Whoever wants to dive into that.
What I would really quickly, I would say I think it's really important. We're not trying to say that this is the same thing. The intention of the government, the policy aims at the highest levels, I think, are the same. But the idea that, to assimilate or to force assimilate or to commit genocide, but then at the implementation level, we automatically get asked about abuse and neglect because that's such a massive part of the story of residential schools in Canada, the horrors of residential schools in Canada. We don't have enough information from Tibet. We assume that there's abuse and neglect, but the idea that, you can see a lot of slick propaganda online in these schools. The facilities can be quite beautiful and new and modern. The food can be fantastic. All of those things are true, and it's still wrong what they're doing. And it's just that the Chinese government knows how to do these things more in a way that they use modernization and universal pre-K education, all these ideas to mask the true intent. But then in their policy documents and decrees, you can see the true intent.
Right. So I guess a few points of difference that I think are useful to understand that I'm gleaning out of that. One is, I guess we know less about what's happening there right now than we do about the history of residential schools in Canada, and that's understandable given the timing and also the work that's been done here on the Canadian side. But then also, it's being justified in sort of modern progressive lingo around education because the Chinese state is sophisticated enough to try to co-opt that discourse for its own advantage. So maybe what you're saying is the ideology is similar, but the rhetoric and the justification is different.
Absolutely, and the resources dedicated in a globalized world to the PR around all of this. That's the key. And we know how much Beijing has invested in its global public relations strategy, essentially.
I might be almost out of time, but does anybody want to add to that in any way, or
a final word?
Yeah, in short, it's the goal of this is to take the Tibetan out of the Tibetan children.
Thank you, Mr. Janis. We'll continue next to Mr. Brunel-Duceppe for 3 minutes.
For 3.5 minutes, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Thank you, Chair. In response to Garnet, if civil society and the politicians of Canada have denounced, the situation that affected Indigenous people, that was great. But I don't think that has happened in China yet. But right now, we are shedding light on these crimes, and these are indeed crimes. So they can't criticize us for having done nothing about our own situation. We have work underway to reconcile with our Indigenous peoples as true Canadians. So I would like to go back to Xi Jinping and the involvement of various institutions and organizations who are working out in Tibet, in China, who are involved in cultural genocide and assimilation. And you've said something about that. But ultimately, the person in charge of this more and more aggressive policy is Xi Jinping. And yet I don't hear Western governments criticizing him directly with regard to Uyghur genocide, residential boarding schools in Tibet. No one ever points to Xi Jinping officially. Would this be the proper approach, especially for democracies around the world? You know, that if people have signed covenants and there is clearly one person responsible who's heading up the genocidal policy, cultural genocidal policy, and genocide of the Uyghurs, shouldn't we directly speak up against Xi Jinping? Apply sanctions or in other ways blame him via parliamentary action. That's my thought. What do you think? Ms. Richardson?
I couldn't agree more. This is a highly centralized political system. It's also one that takes seriously the level of government from which a critique is coming. And so, while it was, I thought, wonderful to see Prime Minister Trudeau at the vote last week, it would be equally important to hear him direct a critique to Xi Jinping specifically on this issue and many, many others.
Oui, Madame.
Yes, Ms. Tetong.
From Tibet will always say that the way you have to understand that the Chinese leadership respects strength. And so to tiptoe around them and to do whatever, to bend over backwards to avoid any uncomfortable exchanges, or we can see that's not their approach. And at the same time, they're doing what they're doing, and it's getting worse in part because we all facilitated it by allowing ourselves to get caught up in endless dialogue with no action, and to take the teeth out of every possible mechanism that could hold them accountable. So I think it's time to return to a stronger position directly, exactly like you said, targeting the very person responsible at the highest levels.
And I'm fully aware that some parliamentarians around the world have economic undertakings with China, and to stand up against China, well, that can lead to economic punishment. And for us, of course, I represent the people of my riding. I think that we need to do what's right. There have been genocides in the past, and we've been slow to react. We now have some serious violations, extreme violations of human rights in China, and the government of Canada, I think, is not doing enough. Of course, you would know more about that. But, and this is just, of course, an editorial comment, I think that Ms. Tetong has really underscored the right approach. Canada has a history of leadership when it comes to human rights, and I'm speaking as a Quebecois sovereigntist. And do you think Canada is able to lead, as it has in the past, lead on human rights in China?
I think absolutely. And I think Canada has demonstrated in more ways than one that as a nation, we're committed to a relationship and a friendship with China. I think that has to be coupled with sticking to our values and for the betterment of all. And I would say also, I mean, it's really important for us to recognize that what we saw in China, the protests by these young people recently against the COVID policies, the sentiments that many of them expressed, and now they've been disappeared. This is not just about us. It's also about them and their rights and their freedoms. And I think there's more opportunity and hope than ever before, sadly, because they've experienced the repression of the COVID policies and just the craziness of the government overreach and the way that people have been treated. But they've expressed solidarity with Uyghurs now. They've come out and risked their lives. So I think we owe it to them also just to do more.
Thank you, Ms. Tetong. Monsieur Bernal-Duceppe. Ms. McPherson, 3.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I would just like to get, I'm trying to make some sort of ties in my brain. I sit on the Canada-China Committee as well as the International Human Rights Committee. And we've been recently talking about Chinese interference in Canada and the impacts that that has had on Chinese Canadians and other folks in Canada. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the intimidation tactics we have heard of. Certainly, there are reportedly police stations across the country, Vancouver, Toronto, Chinese police stations that are being used as sort of bases to intimidate people that are standing up for their rights and that are opposing or dissenting from China. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Thank you for that question. I've actually testified in front of the Canada-China Committee regarding my own case in 2019 when I ran for U of T Student Union President. I was attacked with thousands of death threats and rape threats. I've spoken with CSIS, RCMP, any type of security, you name it. We've also recommended with a report from Amnesty about the least Canadian government can do is have a point person where we could go to be able to have support, because we've just been pointed everywhere but still nowhere to be able to get support. So today, if onwards, because Dr. Jello has been publicly here testifying and telling you folks about the truth, about the hidden policies of the preschool boarding, tomorrow if he gets a threat, he would come to me and ask me for advice, and I'd have no good advice to give him. So this is me with the privileges and access that I've had to Parliament, to every kind of security available in Canada, and I have no response. I don't know what else to say in regards to that. But the intimidation tactics are just all over. With the police stations, we are scared to be able to navigate our own communities. We know that there are spies that are implemented within our communities. For years, we've been telling folks, and now we still have not seen any action. We hope to see that soon.
Well, and certainly we had representatives from the RCMP and CSIS, and of course Minister of Public Safety, and I tried to make that very clear to him that what I'm hearing in my constituency office is that these people have nowhere to go. They have no one to talk to, that they are getting run around, so they are not being protected. One of the other things that we had talked about was the creation of a foreign registry. Do you think that would be a tool that would be helpful for Canada to implement to protect people?
Yes.
Absolutely. That was very, very clear. Well, and I think something that the government has said that they are interested in, but it feels to me like we've had a very long time to do this. This is not new. I think, as all the witnesses have said, none of this is just starting. It's just that it's escalating. It's just that it's getting worse, and we have to act on that. Any comments from those online as well?
Sophie, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, we've looked at this issue in Canada and a couple of other democracies with respect to Chinese government threats to academic freedom, meaning in countries like Canada, the US, et cetera. And that's largely been about the freedom that students and scholars of and from China have to participate in university life and in debates and research free of interference. And I don't think we've seen any democracy or universities take sufficient steps to put protections in place so that people really can learn and study and debate. Equally, Chenny's example is probably one of the best known ones, but we had so many people essentially say to us, we don't feel free to even introduce our ideas or debate them here on a campus, partly because we don't think the institution understands what these pressures are, let alone has put in place mechanisms for reporting or for effective pushback. And so I think that's another possible area that could merit some more attention.
We are seeing that there is research contracts that are going, or research that's happening with the universities across the country. A whole bunch of areas where we need to make sure we're doing more to protect individuals. Mr. Tong, you were.
Yeah, I saw that you want to comment in overtime again. So just very brief remarks, please.
Yeah, I think it's in Canada's national interest. It's not just about protecting us. I think if we protect people in our communities better from the threat that we know the Chinese government is posing, then I think people in the community where all the information resides about what the Chinese government is doing to undermine our elections or whatnot, that information will come out more readily. But I don't think right now people would feel very protected. to come forward with any information like that.
Thank you very much.
And we'll continue to a final round for 2.5 minutes each, starting off with Mr. Battisti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I'm a Mi'kmaq person from a Mi'kmaq community. First, my aunt went to a residential school. I had cousins who went to residential schools, and to hear this testimony, to hear the thoughts around killing the Tibetan in a child, it sounds eerily similar to what the Canadian experience was for First Nations in residential schools. While there are some differences, it's to me very horrifying and sickening to know that governments in this age can be doing things like this. And I'm really glad to be able to hear that, you know, we're doing a study on this and we're bringing this to light. But what more can we do as a Canadian government, as First Nations across Canada, to, you know, who've gone through this process and would not want to see any other nation or any other religion have to go through what we had went through for generations? What more can we do? And if I'll ask.
I think, thank you. Thanks very much again. I think I came here testifying for the case in Tibet in China now. There are many Tibetans, my former students, colleagues, friends, all those communities where I visited, I had to raise the alarm in the international community as my responsibility to my people inside Tibet. So please stand up, support us to increase pressure on China, at least to stop or slow down what they're doing on our age 4 to 6 kids now. Thank you.
One thing I would also really appreciate as a young Tibetan Canadian that has basically been brought up in displaced areas all around the world, just meaningful connections with anyone that's listening, that's First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities that come from that generation and intergenerational trauma. We are currently going through it, and we need to find ways to find just safe spaces, braver spaces to come together and heal, even though that's a long process, and continue to be in solidarity with each other to raise the alarm, as Dr. Jallow said. Thank you.
Did anyone online want to comment as well?
Very brief comment.
Yeah, I think that we have so much to learn, which from the Tibetan side, and I have found strength and guidance from listening to the stories from the survivors of residential schools in Canada, because there's confusion. You know, if you send your kid to a school, are you, then are you choosing that school when you've lived under the system of colonization and repression for so long? Suddenly, is it our fault that we're sending kids to these schools when there's really no choice? And just to in our Tibetan community, I think we have, inside Tibet and outside of Tibet, we have a lot to learn. And I actually, I would appreciate opportunities that Canada could facilitate, even, the government of Canada, perhaps, for us to bring up our level of knowledge in our own community about the threat we face, because we're in it. So it's very hard to see on some level where this ends up.
Thank you. And we'll continue to our next round. Mr. Abultaya for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I was going to mention the 17-point agreement and point number 9 that speaks about the education system. The written on the wall of what China intend from the point number 9 on the 17-point agreement. But my question is this, and the role that Canada can play. On October vote, we were, Ms. Richardson, by the way, on October vote, we were 18 votes away. So can Canada work with the Five Eyes, with our allies, to make sure on the next round we can get to that point, and we can, as international community that do care about human rights, and this situation achieve a similar result to the Uyghur situation that also exists in China.
I can't encourage you strongly enough to pursue that strategy, to find all of the allies you possibly can. It was an unusual group that signed on in October, and I think more could be gained in more diverse supporters. I think it takes a certain diplomatic initiative at the highest level, again, to match Xi Jinping's ambition to push back against that. I think it is doable, but I also think that democracies need to be deciding not just what to do with the Human Rights Council sessions in March and June and September of this year. They need to be thinking about what they should be doing 5 years from now and 10 years from now. They should be thinking now about getting other governments in Asia to run for the Human Rights Council so that China might not be reelected. It came close to losing the last time it ran, and I think with some concerted diplomatic initiative, you could set that as a goal and achieve it. I think part of what the October vote showed was that the Chinese government is in fact within reach of international scrutiny at key human rights bodies. But it takes discipline, it takes resources, and it takes ambition. I would project a decade out and work backwards about everything from colonial boarding schools in Tibet to the Uyghurs to many other issues, Chinese human rights defenders, Hong Kong, transnational repression. There's room for all of those at the UN, and I think you would find that with Canadian leadership, you would have quite a few other governments coming along to support you.
Just on a final thought, I think we would appreciate what's the long-term strategy. I know that time is not with us, but also time is not with China. I think if we start putting in proper efforts, we can achieve some good results out of this and make sure that we put the right where the right belong. So I know that time is short. If you can brief us on a long-term strategy that can be adopted by or can be utilized by any current and future Canadian governments, that would be great. And thank you.
Maybe Ms. Richardson in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds, I would support democracies running for Human Rights Council membership. I would leave no seat or committee uncontested. I would leave no review unattended. And what else? I think strong support to independent civil society groups, including those based in Canada, to participate in reviews of the Chinese government on multiple different levels. Last but not least, I would love to see governments push for the establishment of a special rapporteur on China specifically, as we've seen in other human rights crisis countries.
Thank you for that, Mr. Abultayev. And now, given that both Mr. Brunel-Duceppe and Ms. McPherson got overtime, we're going to reduce this, unfortunately, just to one question each within a minute and a half. But Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, please, vas-y.
Okay, merci.
Thank you, Chair. We hear more and more of China's possibly moving on Taiwan. We're also told that it's not a matter of there being such an international intervention, but rather when it will take place. And when it will take place, what will this mean to Tibetans, to the people of Tibet? Will this have any effect on Tibet if China moves on Taiwan? Ms. Tetong, perhaps you have a comment on this.
I think that for every Tibetan, it's, what seems impossible to others is, of course, totally clear and possible to us. So the fall of Hong Kong is not something that we thought impossible. And now with Taiwan, yeah, we're very, very, all Tibetans are concerned. But I also think we see in Taiwan this, what exists there and the people and the spirit and, that there's actually a lot that should be done to shore up Hong Kong support. And this for Tibetans, I think, is key because we didn't have it when we lost our nation. And we should have worked harder maybe to secure it, but it was a different time. And I just think the key here is self-determination, and the Canadian government and others to support self-determination of people. And it's clear what Taiwanese want, what Hong Kongers want, and I think, what Tibetans and Uyghurs want too matters.
Thank you. If I may, Chair, just to say, what direct effect will it have on the people of Tibet if China moves into Taiwan?
very briefly, if somebody wants a very brief comment on that.
Dr. Gallo?
It's very clear. They will firmly do the further harmful policy and then ultimately eradicate the Tibetan identity, I think.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much, sir.
If folks on the call would like to talk about that, I'm happy to cede my time to Mr. Duceppe on this.
Would anybody like to continue their thoughts on that specific question?
Because I think it's important. We know that China will invade Taiwan. We know that Xi Jinping has that in his lineup. We just don't know when. We think it will happen shortly. Will it necessarily have an impact on cultural minorities within current China, such as Uyghurs and Tibetans? I think there will be an impact, but I would just like to hear it from people like you, Mr. Gallo, who is more aware of what's actually going on, perhaps.
It is very clear from my understanding of the Chinese government. What they're thinking is in order to stabilize the Communist Party's position, in order to lead China, they wanted to move towards become another North Korea. I think the people are talking about this all the time when I was in China, in Tibet. So it's very clear they're going to dramatically change their attitude. They will do the harmful policy as much as they could by promoting their ideology about one nation, which means Chinese, Han Chinese, one language, one country. That's what they already set up the agenda by, say, by the 2035, China gonna be one nation, one culture, one country. Yeah, it's very clear, I think.
Thank you, and that was very gracious of you, Ms. McPherson. And we're now at 3 o'clock. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here, wishing you strength as you continue to raise the issue of Tibet and to educate people like us and society, civil society. We really are grateful for you being here today, taking the time both by Zoom and in person. I'll adjourn the meeting. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.